This video is inspired by the book Abundance by Klein and Thompson. The topic is Investing in Abundance, Transforming Education Finance Through Trickle-Up Economics. Their book was about having abundance. In order to achieve abundance, we need to invest in achieving abundance. That is, invest in our future. In this case, that of the United States. To do that, we need to invest in human capital. Unfortunately, our current education system has legacy constraints tied to wealth, restricting access and reinforcing inequality. Education needs to be seen as an investment in the future, not as a cost for today. To do that, we need to completely change how we finance education to something that more directly links education to outcomes. The book Abundance describes how the U.S. is failing to deliver the goods because of socioeconomic challenges, bureaucracy versus innovation, inefficiencies in various systems like education, and a need for a greater results orientation. That is, productivity is declining across many sectors in the economy. Government is known for stopping bad things rather than imagining and designing good things. Government has also produced an abundance of bureaucracy rather than resources for citizens. Liberal government has become process obsessed rather than outcomes oriented. We need to look at some causes of these problems related to education and housing inequality, access barriers, and the cycle of privilege in both K through 12 education and higher education, as well as political challenges. For example, the authors describe how zoning restrictions and tax policies have limited the supply of new housing, driving up home prices beyond the reach of many residents. This is only part of the problem. Local communities have also failed to deliver on a most critical task, providing quality schools and safe neighborhoods. More families are competing for fewer quality neighborhoods, bidding up prices. The result is increasing disparities between high-priced homes and low-priced homes. This gap between high home prices, high rents, and high property taxes versus low prices and taxes also acts as a kind of zoning restriction. Moreover, students from rich families attend expensive private colleges. The situation is similar to how private health insurers are not in the business of making people healthier. Rather, they prefer to insure those who are already healthy. This is the adverse selection problem of private insurance markets. Unfortunately, public education policy is similar. Communities, public schools, and higher education all compete for students and families who are already the most educated and productive, bidding up prices. The process of bidding up prices is manifested in wages, tuition, property taxes, etc. Moreover, lawsuits are prevalent with public education. For example, if school districts want to provide vouchers for private schools that include religious schools, certain groups will sue based upon the Religious Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. If they exclude those religious schools, they will get sued by religious groups based upon the Religious Prohibition Clause. Similarly, some schools may be pressured into promoting certain national agendas against the wishes of national parent groups, as it may be perceived as indoctrination over education. But if they teach controversial subjects, they'll be sued by various state legislatures. Finally, if schools fail to show progress with minority groups, they will be sued for civil rights violations per Title VI and 9 of the Civil Rights Act. If they are too assertive regarding diversity, They'll be sued for discrimination against the majority. The point is, school districts get sued either way. We need a greater human capital focus. As a society, we spend so much on education, like healthcare and transportation, and yet get so little for this spending. A productivity problem. Productivity meaning outcomes per inputs. We need to invest in human capital first and foremost. However, we need systems in place that choose investments that will deliver strong returns while simultaneously stopping spending where there are poor returns. In order to successfully deliver affordable housing or green infrastructure, we need to develop the human capital that will be capable of designing, inventing, deploying, and governing these institutions. Human capital investments are instrumental to giving all a fair shot to fully participate in the modern economy. Essentially, both public and higher education financing needs to be premised on generating future wealth rather than being driven by current wealth. The federal government should create a national return on investment model, which again means outcomes per inputs, which is designed to add value to human capital. Such a system would constitute trickle-up economics. Trickle-up economics suggests that investments made in individuals in a lower socioeconomic class will raise the income of society overall. The system should empower citizens through education, provide feedback loops through outcomes, and align incentives. Local accountability is central to this reform, meaning local autonomy regarding process with nationally standardized outcomes. Local governments would be responsible for producing value for their residents. Goods like some public education, for example, pre-K, K through 12, and community college, constitute local public goods, as they can be more efficiently produced and distributed locally, as long as local jurisdictions actually lift people up economically in a measurable way. Local governments should have both greater authority and greater accountability. An earlier book by Klein addressed our polarization. So that is, in the spirit of federalism, we could nationalize this trickle-up economics model while allowing local school districts to design their own processes for achieving those standard outcomes. The key to this proposal is deciding what are national values and what are local preferences. It's important to bridge divides in order to create shared solutions by focusing on outcomes. We need constructive dialogue, not by debating morality, but by inspiring collective action by standardizing outcomes while allowing local experimentation and adaptation according to local values. Moreover, the trickle-up economics model could itself inspire collective action, as it represents a compromise between trickle-down economics and the income redistribution of the New Deal, both of which have largely been rejected by the American public. The proposal in this video is premised on the principles of the capital-owning democracy, a perspective that stems from the founding of America. Capital-owning democracy, or as it's sometimes called, property-owning democracy, argues that state institutions should guide an equal distribution of productive property across the masses rather than allowing monopolies to dominate, ensuring that all individuals have a fair and equal opportunity to participate in political and economic life. Unfortunately, in many ways, the U.S. has walked away from its historical roots. After the Industrial Revolution centralized power in the private sector the New Deal centralized power in the public sector. The New Deal sometimes shied away from more radical reform, targeting mass property ownership, and instead focused on Keynesian economics and welfare state measures. As a result, one could say that New Deal liberalism and its emphasis on income support reflected the triumph of the capitalist welfare state, that is, maintaining monopolistic control over both resources and income redistribution. The movement away from more radical reform may be attributable to the availability of an alternative solution, Keynesian fiscal policy. Keynesian economics presented the idea that the government could manage the economy without managing the institutions that manage the economy. Centralized ownership of the means of production and redistribution could be maintained. In order to compensate for failures in the private market, the government should simply ensure enough income to boost consumption after the fact, meaning redistribution, rather than providing productive assets to the masses beforehand, meaning predistribution. But this predistribution approach also defends against the conservative criticism of progressivism as disincentivizing work. This ownership society also contends that a just society requires that individuals possess productive means, but not just financial and physical capital, but human capital as well. That is, the means of production in contemporary society refers to human as well as real capital, that is, knowledge and an understanding of institutions, educated abilities, and trained skills. In other words, human capital is one of the most important forms of capital one can possess in the modern knowledge economy. The question is, how can individuals and communities have a greater claim on their own human capital resources? A way to improve public education, meaning truly lift people up economically, while equalizing access to quality education regardless of current wealth, is to design an education system around the income share agreement or income contingent loan. The income share agreement is a financial structure where investors provide a fixed amount of money to a recipient who in exchange agrees to pay back a percentage of their income for a set number of years. Income share agreements focus on future value, reduce risk for students, and align incentives of stakeholders. Both private tuition and higher education and property tax funding for local public education reflect the legacy problem, the past driving the future. Legacy provides both the college and quality school districts their reputations, and hence their attractiveness to potential students and residents. Both situations maintain privileged access to resources by an elite class. ISAs can mitigate this problem. Benefits of ISAs are they are efficient in allocating education resources. They focus those resources on future potential rather than past performance, improving the quality and access, and they reduce risk for students. One of the largest examples, started in 2016 from Purdue University, signed more than 1,900 ISAs with students, dispersing $21 million backed by the Purdue Research Foundation. Now, there is a growing free college movement around the world, motivated by concerns about rising inequality and declining investments in public education. However, the UK demonstrates a different path to take. Until the 1990s, students in the UK could attend public universities for free. Unfortunately, this caused a dramatic increase in the number of students attending and ballooning total costs, necessitating enrollment caps, along with declining spending per student, which likely may have affected quality. This led to rising inequality in college attainment, necessitating reforms in 1998, including introducing tuition charges. However, the loans were income contingent, where by design, low-earning graduates pay back less of their borrowed funds than do high earners. The income contingent loan repayment system allowed students to borrow more, enabling them to access more of their future earnings to support current expenses while enrolled. This removed two barriers to access: upfront cost and the confusion associated with the financial aid systems at the beginning of college. Repayment begins after graduation or upon securing a job. This restructuring of higher education finance over the last 20 years or so has not stopped rising enrollments in the UK, while institutional resources per student have increased substantially. Moreover, after many years of widening inequality, socioeconomic gaps in college attainment appear to have stabilized or even slightly declined. The moral is that free college is not the only way to increase quantity, quality, and equity in higher education. Indeed, a free system may actually stand in the way of these objectives. Therefore, the national trickle-up economics model might combine direct taxpayer investment, meaning individual claims on human capital resources, with the demand for public sector performance outcomes, termed performance-based crowdfunding. Public education institutions, both high school and college, or even local jurisdictions, could underwrite income share agreements with their own graduates. Current workers invest in, meaning they fund those institutions through payroll deduction, and the employers of their graduates pay back the return into individual retirement savings accounts. By underwriting their own graduates' income share agreements, jurisdictions become investment opportunities and would compete according to how efficiently they can translate current input wages into future outcome wages. This system also internalizes human capital, meaning to correctly fully value it. All investments made, both privately and publicly, within the jurisdiction, which truly create economic value, would be measured in this model, and educational investment dollars will chase those opportunities. This proposal constitutes a tuitionless college funding model and a property taxless public education funding model, equalizing access. Since the payback of income share agreements takes decades, this plan is best if offered as part of a retirement system, such as Social Security. This would require increasing the payroll tax on the wealthy, as the Social Security system would then fund two systems: the current pension plus these investments in educational institutions and jurisdictions. So how does this help us to build what we need for the future? In order to have abundance in the future, we need to actually invest accordingly now. Policies that might derive from this idea should accomplish four things. First, greater federalism would mitigate government gridlock at the national level, as we would no longer change our values at every election. There would be greater policy continuity locally. Second, policies from this idea would mitigate our focus on symbols and mere language, what Klein and Thompson term lawn sign liberalism, towards something more concrete and actionable. Third, this approach would reduce the moral hazard and rent-seeking behavior from local governments because they would be accountable for results. That is, national public education would no longer center around providing commitments contingent on failure. Rather, it would instead make commitments contingent on success. Finally, a fourth benefit of this policy is that national trickle-up economics model. This constitutes trickle-up economics because of equal access, where current wealth is irrelevant, and the return on educational investment model, which is explained next. Now let's elaborate on how the secondary schools and primary schools would each be financed. One problem with current municipal finance is separating by rich versus poor, which one might call economic segregation. That is, we need the financing of local government to be separate from relocation and local finance, creating a national crowdfunding system. Capital moves more easily than people, and many residents cannot afford either higher quality schooling or relocation. The solution is to create a national return on investment model driven by percentage returns, not absolute dollar gains, creating a trickle-up economic system. If underserved, underinvested, and disenfranchised regions are set up as investments, they should comprise the best opportunities if those local governments actually create long-term value. With this proposal, districts would translate current wages into future wages, inputs into outcomes. Wealthy districts, starting from a higher tax base, would require a higher increase for the same percentage return. That is to say, a district with double the wealth, meaning tax base, of a poor district would require double the value creation to offer the same return. So extra wealth, instead of being an advantage, becomes a hurdle. And you also have equal access to all public education because the income share agreements are nationally crowdfunded rather than by tuition or property taxes. So current wealth becomes irrelevant. Of course, income share agreements focusing on graduation would target secondary schools, namely high schools and colleges, community colleges. However, primary education is also essential for education. Every single elementary school in the U.S. could be operated by a homeowners association within that school district. These homeowners associations or neighborhood associations or housing cooperatives could also be nationally crowdfunded, eliminating the problem of economic segregation with local funding. Local residents would still pay fees to the association as a percent of home value, which rather than funding association expenses, which comes from its taxpayer investors, would then provide the return to those taxpayer investors. The associations that build the greatest value by increasing home values by enacting policies that make the neighborhood more attractive to potential residents would offer the best investment opportunities and potential returns. Again, associations starting at lower home values would have greater room to improve. The associations could perform many neighborhood functions, not just primary schooling, but whatever increases home values. Associations currently often provide grounds and building maintenance, security, recreational facilities, community centers, and sometimes even neighborhood parks and roads. However, one could even envision these associations operating pre-K daycare, primary health care, and neighborhood policing as well. National crowdfunding of associations likely would dictate much greater regulation of associations from cities, states, and the federal government, and could be combined with policies designed to increase home ownership. The key to success is reconciling diverse perspectives. It is important to increase participation among local parent groups as well as local teachers, but focusing on what they're for, not what they're against. Parents should have a say over their children's curriculum. We should reduce the influence of national interest groups who are responsible for gridlock and lawsuits and increase those of local stakeholders who currently feel voiceless. The needed structure to engage stakeholders already exists in the local school board. In a municipality, administrators, teachers, parents, and students alike could become allies rather than adversaries, working together for solutions rather than blaming each other for problems, integrating them as co-participants in value creation. So in conclusion, this proposal should shift education finance, creating a national trickle-up economics model, encouraging greater collaboration among local stakeholders that are currently competing for resources, and empower those stakeholders to generate sustainable growth. The trickle-up economic systems means that increasing lower wages provides a better percentage return than increasing higher wages by the same absolute dollar amount. And the same holds true for increasing home values, providing greater access and equity. This is a new take on the solo growth model, but in a domestic context. Additional bonuses for reducing poverty rates, new housing construction quotas, and increasing homeownership rates, and homeowners' equity per resident, as opposed to bank assets, might deliver results surpassing those of the New Deal. And such a policy might help bring the United States back to its historical roots as a capital-owning democracy. And these are the references that were used for this video presentation.